As we continue on in this lesson regarding service authentication and account policies, we've pretty much covered service authentication and the different types of service accounts in the previous sub-lesson. So in this lesson, we're going to switch gears and take a look at account policies. I'll introduce what they are and look at how to create and configure these account policies. And these account policies are available at both the local computer level as well as the domain level. Now, speaking of domain levels, that's where we're going to begin by looking at the different types of policies that we'd be focusing on. A password policy, account lockout, and Kerberos policy settings are all configured within the domain account settings, and we're going to look at each of these in detail. And we configure these domain account policies using the default domain policy via the group policy management editor. We'll drill in, as you can see here, to the computer configuration. We'll find a category called policies within there. We'll find Windows settings, then we'll find the security settings, and way down at the bottom, we'll find account policies. And that's where we'll go and explore in just a little bit. But when we get into that level, we're going to see that we have several different options here. And as you can see at the password policy setting, we have 6 different flavors of settings that we can configure here. And the first one is to enforce password history. This prevents users from reusing passwords. The default value is 24. So if I use a password called Brian today, I need to cycle through 23 additional passwords before I can ever use Brian again. The maximum password age decides when the users have to change their password. The default is 42. And you can also define a minimum password age, which prevents users from actually cycling through 23 times or 24 times to get back to the original password. This ensures you have the new password for a minimum amount of time. We have a minimum password link to make sure the passwords are not too short. And we have a password must meet complexity requirements to ensure we're not using something like Brian as a password. In fact, the complexity enforces that you don't use the username or your account username. It has to be at least 6 characters, and it must contain characters from at least 3 of 4 groups: uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numerals, and then special non-alphanumeric characters such as the bang or the exclamation point, the @ sign, the pound sign, the asterisk, the ampersand. Those are special characters that we can use in our password. And if we set that up, your users have to use 3 out of the 4 when they set their new passwords. And the last one is to store passwords using reversible encryption. And this is really for some of the older apps that needed to know the user's password before they can continue on. And this can be set at a per user basis. So if you have someone running an Antique operating system or app, you can set that up at a per user basis. Our second category are called account lockout policy settings, the account lockout duration. So what if I mistype my password 12 times? How long will it keep my account locked out before it releases it and allows me to log in again? The account lockout threshold, what's the number of tries I get? Do I get 3? Do I get 7? Do I get 12? By default, it's set to 0. So you can bang away on the password for quite some time. Most of your higher security places do set up an account lockout threshold. And then we also have the reset account lockout counter after so many minutes. By default, this is not enabled. So what I could do is set my account lockout threshold at 5 and set this reset account lockout counter after 30 minutes. I strike out 5 times. I wait 30 minutes. I get to strike out 5 more times. I wait 30 minutes, I can strike out 5 more times. So we do have that as a configuration option as well. And our next category is the Kerberos policy settings. And the first is to enforce user logon restrictions, forcing your domain controllers to perform additional validation on a user's rights policy to help enforce security. The default for this specific setting is enabled. And then we have a maximum lifetime for a service ticket. What's the maximum amount of time a user's service ticket can be allowed? The default is 600 minutes. But we can change that to as low as 10 minutes. Now looking at our third one, which is the maximum lifetime for a user ticket, or the TGT they call it. The default for this is 10 hours. This is the maximum age for that TGT. Maximum lifetime for user ticket renewal. And as you can see, the default is 7 days. And this determines the length of time a user needs to renew their TGT. And the last one is maximum tolerance for computer clock synchronization. Yeah, another mouthful here. And that determines the sensitivity to disparity between your client computer and a domain controller. The default is 5 minutes. Now this does take into consideration time zones. But if my domain controller is in the East time zone and it's 10 p.m. and my client computer is in the Pacific time zone and it's 7 p.m., that's okay. But if it's 6:45 p.m. for my client and 10 p.m. for my domain controller, that's a 15-minute weird disparity that will be recognized and flagged, and they use the PDC emulator FSMA role for the clock synchronization. Well, that's enough talk about these different account policies. Let's drop back out to our domain controller in our domain and explore how to locate and configure these domain account policies. So we're back in our domain controller through Server Manager. We're going to Tools. We're skipping past ADUC. I know you're used to me stopping there, but we're going to go to Group Policy Management. And then we're going to click on that. We're going to expand on the forest, and we have our domains. We have the azmtppearson.com domain. If we go to the linked group policy objects, here's the default domain policy that we want to modify the domain account policies on. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to click Edit, and we want to go to the computer configuration, policies. So I'm double clicking as I'm doing this, Windows settings, security settings, and then you see we have the account policies here, and we have our password policy where we can modify the password history, the maximum and the minimum password age, the minimum password length, and whether or not the password must meet complexity requirements and store passwords using reversible encryption. We talked about all of these. And these are all the default settings, as you can see here in the right-hand column. I have not modified any of these up to this point. So let's go ahead and change one of these, and we'll go ahead and set the minimum password age. We'll say that it has to be 5 days before they can change the password, so no one cycles through a bunch of passwords to get back to the original. And you'll see that it's set at 5 days. So that's one area of settings. We'll go back to the account lockout policy this time. So you'll see we have the account lockout duration. That's not defined. Account lockout threshold has 0 invalid logon attempts, and reset account lockout counter after. So if we want to go in and set an account lockout duration, click the define policy, and we're going to say that 15 minutes is the duration for the account lockout. Go ahead and do an OK. And saying, by the way, dude, if you're going to do this, we have some suggested value changes here. Account lockout threshold, instead of not defined, should be 5 invalid logon attempts, suggested setting. Reset account lockout counter, instead of not defined, 15 minutes. Now check this out. If I click OK, like, okay, thanks for the suggestion, do an OK, it sets that for me. So be careful. If you don't want these additional settings, you need to hit cancel there. So just a little heads up on that for you. And then in here we have our Kerberos policy. Notice we have enforced user logon restrictions. That's enabled by default. And we have the other settings that we talked about. 600 minutes for a maximum lifetime for a service ticket. We have a TGT for 10 hours. We have a TGT renewal for 7 days. And the computer clock synchronization for 5 minutes. So this is where I would come in and configure these domain account policy settings using the Group Policy Management Editor. As I mentioned previously, in addition to domain account policies, we have local account policies where we can go in and we can configure password-related settings as we just did. Kerberos, password policies, account lockout settings, but these are specific to that server. We access these through the Server Manager and Tools, but we drop into the local security policy instead of going to the Group Policy Management console. But just a heads up, the local security policies that you apply are overridden by domain security policies if that machine or that server is part of a domain. Let's just go out and take a look at how we manage our local account policies and how the domain account policies affect your local account policies. We're still going to go into Server Manager here, and we're still going to go to the Tools option, but we're going to go down to an option we haven't been into yet called Local Security Policy. We're going to click on that, and you're going to see right at the top we have our account policy, so I'm going to click on that. And we have the same 3 categories we looked at in the domain level: password, account, and Kerberos. Now remember, we made a couple of modifications up there. If I go to the password policy, remember I changed my minimum password age to 5 days? There it is. Remember I said the domain policies override your local policies? This is an example of that. What's the other one I changed? I changed the account lockout policy to 15 minutes, 5 invalid logon attempts, and 15 minutes for the reset. You see these at this level on this server because it's part of that domain. So just be aware that we can set these at the local server level, but if that server is part of a domain and those settings are configured at the domain, those settings will be applied and override your local settings. So this is how we manage the domain and local account policies, specifically the password, the account lockout, and the Kerberos settings.